While the generals planned the invasion of Europe, a 19-year-old girl with a scrap of paper was about to solve the one mistake that would have lost the entire war. At 07:10 in the morning on a humid July day in 1943, the Lake City Ordnance Plant outside Independence, Missouri, was already shaking under the weight of its own machines. Rows of stamping presses hammered brass into cartridge cups. Heat radiated from annealing furnaces, and conveyor belts clattered in an endless loop. The air carried a heavy metallic smell mixed with oil and sweat. At this moment in history, America needed ammunition at a scale no nation had ever attempted. Combat commanders in the Solomons were reporting burning through hundreds of thousands of rounds in a single week. Infantry units in Sicily demanded more. Fighter squadrons over Europe emptied their .50 caliber belts so fast that ordnance officers joked it took more ammunition to keep a B-17 in the air than it did to build the plane itself. The need was bottomless, and the math was unforgiving. Washington estimated that to sustain simultaneous operations in the Pacific and the Mediterranean, the United States needed roughly 2.4 billion rounds every single month. Actual output at that moment was barely half. Inside the factory, 19-year-old Evelyn Carter pushed her cart of brass casings toward Line 4 and tried not to think about the crushing weight of those numbers. Workers whispered about the deficit during coffee breaks. Combat reports from the front lines all said the same thing. Units were rationing ammunition, not because of broken supply lines, but because America simply was not making enough. Evelyn had started working here only 12 weeks earlier, but even she understood the gravity of the situation. She watched supervisors frown at production charts pinned to clipboards and overheard engineers muttering about bottlenecks that seemed impossible to clear. She noticed something else, too, something the foreman seemed almost afraid to admit. The most delicate part of the entire operation, the moment where raw casings had to be fed into alignment tracks before charging and crimping, was still done by human hands, working in a repetitive pattern that had not changed since 1918. By 07:20, a new shift had settled in. 6 women gathered at the feeder table, their arms moving in tight, exhausting loops. Pick, place, slide. Pick, place, slide. These 3 motions were repeated thousands of times each hour. The plant hoped for 30,000 fed casings every hour on this line, but on most days it stalled at 23,000. The difference, when scaled across the entire facility, meant millions of missing rounds every 24 hours. One broken fingernail, one slight slip, or one jammed guide rail, and the entire sequence froze. Evelyn learned quickly that the real enemy inside a wartime plant was not sabotage or defective metal. It was seconds, lost seconds. At 07:26, a guide rail snapped loose and a spill of casings scattered across the floor. Production stopped. A red warning lamp flashed overhead as supervisors sprinted in. The women stepped back, wiping sweat from their foreheads. They knew the drill. Every stoppage meant recalibration, and every recalibration meant lost output. Somewhere in the Pacific, a Marine machine gun crew was firing faster than Lake City could replenish. As Evelyn knelt to gather the spilled casings, something odd tugged at her attention. She looked at the pattern of the women's hands, the rhythm, and the looping motion of their wrists and shoulders. It was circular, predictable, and mechanical in its own way. She hesitated, watching the motion repeat as the workers resumed their stations. Pick, place, slide. It was an orbit rather than a line. She should have returned to her cart, but instead she found herself staring, trying to place the familiarity of that motion. It was on the tip of her mind, a memory from a high school history textbook, or perhaps a museum trip with her father. A machine that spun to feed something faster than human hands could ever manage. She tried to shake the thought off. It was absurd. She was no engineer, just a teenager earning 80 cents an hour. And yet the idea would not leave. A rotating pattern, multiple stations sharing the load, a ring of feeders instead of a row. Efficiency could be gained not by forcing workers to move faster, but by letting the machine carry the motion for them. The shape formed in her mind so suddenly that she stopped in the middle of the aisle. A wheel, a drum, a rotating star of loading slots, like a Gatling gun. She remembered the name now, the old multi-barreled gun from the Civil War that increased firing rate by rotating barrels instead of demanding one barrel cool down. What if rotation could solve the bottleneck that linear motion could not? It was a foolish comparison, she told herself, and yet the idea pulsed with a strange clarity. As she pushed through the heat toward the rear of the factory, she felt the oddest sensation. Not inspiration exactly, but more like inevitability, as though the solution had been sitting in plain sight and she had simply tripped over it. If she was right, even a modest improvement might ripple outward across the entire plant. A handful of seconds saved at each station, multiplied by hundreds of workers, scaled across 12 lines, 24 hours a day. The numbers could climb quickly. What she didn't know yet was how that small observation, born in the middle of a jammed assembly line, would grow into a mechanism capable of doubling Lake City's daily output. For now, all she had was a half-formed idea she barely understood. But ideas shape wars more than we admit. If you believe, like I do, that the smallest observations often create the largest shifts in history, comment the number 7. At 0800 hours, the plant whistle screamed again in a long metallic blast that signaled the official start of the day shift. The night crew shuffled out with the hollow-eyed look of people who had moved brass and steel through their hands for 14 hours straight. The day crew moved in, stepping around the bins of warm casings that still emitted a copper smell. A clipboard hung near the entrance with the morning numbers handwritten in pencil. Units short. Again, the deficit looked small on paper, but scaled across the coming invasions in 2 oceans, those missing rounds turned into something far heavier. Commanders in Europe were reporting firefights where American platoons nearly went black on ammunition. The Army's own quartermaster analysis predicted that if output did not rise by at least 20% by autumn, entire offensives might stall for lack of bullets. Not tanks, not planes, but bullets. By 0833, the heat had climbed past what most would consider survivable. Lake City had been designed for production, not comfort. Long glass windows caught the morning sun and turned the place into a convection chamber. Furnaces warmed the annealing rooms, and steam rose from coolant baths. Workers wore cotton headbands to keep sweat out of their eyes, but it did not help much. Supervisors carried pocket thermometers that routinely showed temperatures pushing 97 degrees. No one complained. Complaining did not add brass to the belts or move the war a minute closer to ending. Evelyn pushed her cart toward the main floor and watched the rhythmic sway of moving belts. America was fighting a war of distance, a war that demanded material over finesse, tonnage over elegance. To take a single island in the Pacific, gunners might fire 500,000 rounds. A flight of P-47s could empty entire belts in mere seconds. The math was merciless. The front line would always demand more than the factories could supply. At 0813, a foreman pulled out the previous day's production summary. The line graphs were brutal. Lake City had managed a monthly high of roughly 1.4 billion rounds, but for the war planners that was a crisis. Reports from Sicily said infantry companies were reducing training fire because they feared they would not have enough for combat. In the Solomons, platoon leaders wrote home asking families to petition representatives for more ammunition. A Marine sergeant had scribbled a note that said, "We are running the guns hot enough to melt the jackets, send more." Evelyn paused as an inspector checked casing dimensions. Precision mattered, and precision took time, but the real monster was throughput. 1,000 of anything was achievable. 1 billion per month was something else entirely. During the morning briefing, a lieutenant from the Ordnance Department read a memo. Consumption rates had risen by 30%. Failure here meant failure everywhere else. Evelyn listened, her shoulders tensing as he explained that the margin between enough and catastrophe often came down to minutes. Evelyn caught herself imagining what a single percentage point of efficiency might look like at scale. A 1% improvement meant 14 million additional rounds per month. A 5% improvement meant 70 million. These were numbers so large they barely made sense, yet the war ran on them. At 0833, as the workers scattered back to their stations, Evelyn hesitated. She was not an engineer or a scientist. She had no authority, but she had eyes, and she had noticed patterns others had not. She kept replaying that circular rhythm of a rotating gun mechanism. If you believe that wars are shaped more by production numbers than battlefield tactics, comment the number 7. By 0911, the idea pressed at her like a half-remembered dream. The line was running, but it was limping. 6 pairs of hands repeating the same exhausted choreography, a loop disguised as a line. Then her breath caught. She suddenly saw the shape clearly, a wheel, a rotating carrier, a principle that had existed for nearly 80 years, yet no one here seemed to notice. No one asked why the numbers always lagged. They simply tried harder, with more hands and longer shifts. Evelyn felt a small pulse of defiance. Trying harder was not going to get Lake City to 2 billion rounds per month. Doing the same thing faster did not change the math. Changing the motion might. She slipped away from the line and walked toward a scrap bin. It was filled with broken pallets and discarded metal brackets. She picked through the pile, feeling the rough ends of cut dowels and the cold rim of a discarded bearing ring. She knew she needed something circular that could turn without binding. The moment she touched the bearing ring, she felt a spark of recognition. A wheel needed a heart, and this could be it. Behind a stack of crates, she began assembling a rough outline on the concrete floor. She arranged wooden slats in a star pattern, testing how they might rotate around the bearing ring. Her fingers trembled. She was not supposed to be inventing anything, but the urgency of the idea overpowered any concern for protocol. At 0931, a mechanic found her. He raised an eyebrow, and she blurted out an explanation about a conveyor that rotated to redistribute the load. The mechanic listened, skeptical but amused. Then he asked what problem she was trying to solve. When she answered throughput, he nodded. That was a language everyone at Lake City spoke. She tried rotating her improvised star, and it wobbled, but the principle was confirmed. Rotational transfer instead of linear transfer, a wheel instead of a conveyor belt. Each rotation could deliver a fresh set of casings without forcing human hands into the tight, repetitive patterns that caused jams. She measured the diameter with her forearm. 26 inches would be big enough to carry 3 trays at once. At 0942, she went to a drafting table and drew a rough design, a central ring, a rotating plate, and peripheral slots angled to cradle casings. If the wheel rotated 9 times per minute, each revolution could feed 1,000 casings. The line could exceed 60,000 units per hour. When the foreman found her and demanded an explanation, she held up the paper, her voice trembling as she explained the concept of an inverted Gatling gun feeder. The foreman did not scold her. He simply said they would test the model during lunch break because desperation had a way of opening doors. At 11:22, the maintenance crew cleared a space beside line 2. They didn't shut the line down, they simply carved out a pocket of floor where a wooden mock-up could spin. A circle of exhausted workers gathered. At 11:23, Evelyn set the crude wheel onto a temporary spindle. It wobbled and the slats were uneven, but it was proof of motion. The mechanic attached a small belt from a motor and flicked the switch. The wheel jerked and then spun with a jittery rhythm. Evelyn placed 3 casings into the recesses. One fell correctly, another bounced out, the third shot across the bench and clattered onto the floor. The workers burst into laughter. The wheel was too light and too uneven.
Evelyn swallowed hard, her cheeks burning. She adjusted the recesses and slowed the motor. The next rotation was better, but still inconsistent. The idea was not wrong, but the build was. And as failure loomed, she realized this was where most ideas died, because the first attempt embarrassed the creator. But at 11:25, the mechanic stepped forward and asked for one more rotation. He steadied the wheel with his hands, lowering the speed until it resembled the slow sweep of a lifehouse beam. Evelyn placed 3 more casings. The wheel turned. One casing fed cleanly. The second corrected itself at the guide lip. The third fell exactly where it needed to. A small ripple of surprise moved through the workers. It was not success yet, but it was motion that made sense. When the test ended, an older woman from line 4 approached Evelyn. She pointed at a dent on a casing and told her that fatigue did that to metal and to people. She told Evelyn that anything reducing that repetition was worth trying. Encouraged, Evelyn sat by the loading dock and redrew the design. Deeper recesses, rubber lining for grip, a weight ring to stabilize rotation, and a metal spindle. She added a second wheel, then a third, creating a synchronized triple feed system that could act like a mechanical heartbeat. One wheel would feed while another reloaded. Continuous motion instead of stop and start drudgery. Failure had not killed the idea, it had revealed its weak points. If you agree that the first failure of an idea matters less than the courage to refine it, comment the number 7. At 12:47, the foreman called Evelyn to the supervisor's platform. She expected a reprimand, but instead she found a procurement officer, a plant engineer, and the mechanic staring at her sketch. The engineer asked her to explain the concept again. She pointed to her revised drawing, explaining that a staggered rotation meant no pauses and no dead time. The engineer nodded. Her math was not exact, but it was not fantasy. If the system worked, the theoretical throughput approached 100,000 casings per hour. The engineer showed her a level of respect she had never seen before. At 1300 hours, the procurement officer authorized the night shift to build a steel prototype. A rumor reached the assembly floor and workers began to whisper. A multi-wheel synchronized feed was untested and improbable, but if it worked, it would change everything. The women on line 4 looked at Evelyn with pride and worry. At 1316, the engineer translated her drawing into engineering language. When a supervisor asked what would happen if it jammed, the engineer replied, "If it jams, we fix it. If it works, we rewrite the rulebook." Line 6 choked again just then, losing another 4,000 casings. The need for something new had shifted from curiosity to necessity. The mechanic handed Evelyn a scrap of steel and told her to make any final adjustments. She revised the angle of the recesses and adjusted the alignment lip. She understood that the design did not need to be perfect, it just needed to relieve the exhaustion of the workers. Throughput was endurance. The procurement officer called headquarters to report a potential improvement, though he did not mention the 19-year-old girl behind it. To Evelyn, that anonymity felt like protection. By 1400 hours, the shift settled into its grind, but the air had changed. A supervisor whispered that this thing might double the output. Evelyn realized that an idea born from spilled casings had now become momentum. At 1940 that night, the maintenance bay glowed under harsh lamps. The first real prototype took shape. Steel, not wood, no wobble. The night crew believed they had run out of alternatives, and the weight of the war was demanding an answer. The new wheel was 28 inches across, cut from steel with a stabilizing ring and rubber lining. It was heavy, which mattered because weight would fight the vibration of the factory. The engineer inspected the prototype and motioned for Evelyn to step forward. At 20:03, the mechanic flipped the switch. The motor growled, and the wheel began turning in a smooth, steady arc. A low hum filled the room. The first test began with 20 casings. One by one, they reached the feed lip and dropped into the chute. 19 out of 20 fell cleanly. It was staggering. The engineer timed the cycle and realized the throughput could rise to more than 50,000 casings per hour on a single station. He did the math 3 times. The war had reduced itself to rounds per shift and minutes saved. They repeated the test again and again at different speeds. The wheel wanted to work. At 2032, Evelyn stepped back, watching the steel motion she could finally trust. The sound was different now, less like a factory struggling and more like a system breathing evenly. This was direction. Numbers could rise and quotas could be met. Somewhere, months later, a soldier would fire a weapon loaded with ammunition that existed because of this moment. Do you believe technological breakthroughs are built from hundreds of tiny corrections rather than single moments of genius? If so, comment 7. The next morning at 0705, the new rotating feeder was bolted into place on line 2. It looked crude and overbuilt, but the foreman told the crew that if it worked, they would feel it before they saw it. The switch snapped, and the wheel began its heartbeat. The workers leaned in as the first cluster of casings was delivered with a rhythm that felt unnatural. No jam, no hesitation. The feed rate ticked past 700, then 780. It was unmistakable. The entire line seemed to exhale. The superintendent watched the production counter hit 80,000 casings in a single hour, a threshold Lake City had never achieved. The room erupted in a stunned electric silence. Everyone understood they had crossed into new territory. The superintendent authorized the immediate fabrication of more units and a full conversion of the remaining lines. A memo went to Washington about an experimental increase in efficiency. No names were given, just the numbers wartime bureaucracy trusted. Evelyn descended the platform, feeling the vibration of the floor through her boots. She passed workers who offered small nods of approval. She had dared to see a problem clearly, and in doing so, she had changed the trajectory of the war.
If you believe that wars are won not only by armies, but by factories that learn to think differently, comment the number 7. And subscribe to see how this innovation pushed American output into territory no enemy believed possible.